Hello, how are you doing? Welcome back from the sunny East Nuke. Quite a seaside based one today, in that I'm walking down along the coast, so there might be a few gulls and some unfamiliar noises coming into this recording, just an FYI. Today we have an absolutely cracking episode that I think you're going to really enjoy. It's Todd Hargrove, obviously you know this by this point, but Todd has really, his work has really informed how we think and teach at Wildstrong, and we've had a few of his books for a long time, and they're both on our main reading list for our course. The one that I love is Playing with Movement. It's just one of those people that can put into words the concepts that we've been thinking about and really come up with useful ways of concisely explaining quite complex ideas. So I really recommend reading his books. We wanted to get on right now because at the moment he is writing a book in a way that I thought was really interesting. If you're on his Substack already, you'll know this, but basically every month or so he sends out the new chapter and invites comment, and that will kind of inform what the end book looks like. And I've been really enjoying reading those chapters as they come out, so you can subscribe to his Substack and be part of that. Today, Andrew and Todd sit down and talk about emergent learning, ecological dynamics, and this kind of weird, messy nature of pain and movement. I think you're really going to get a lot out of this. So I will leave you to it, and I'll be back at the end.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, I am here today with Todd Hargrove, and I already embarrassed Todd before the recording started saying that we actually have a few of his quotes in our course, and he's been really influential in a lot of our thinking. So the way the interview is going to go today is I want to give Todd an opportunity to kind of talk about some of his ideas that have influenced me, but I also want to talk about some of his current projects. So I'm really excited to get him on today, and I'll go ahead and introduce him. So Todd Hargrove, who are you, and how did you get here?
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I live in Seattle. I used to be a massage therapist and was trained in Rolfing and the Feldenkrais method. Before that, I was an attorney. And after I started doing massage for a while, there was clients kind of asking me the same questions. I started writing things down to kind of because the same questions came up. That turned into a blog. I was surprised people read the blog. At some point, that turned into two books, and now I'm on to a third.
Cool. Yeah, I've read your two previous books, and also the way you're publishing your current book is you're doing the chapters on Substack, which I'm really enjoying and I want to get into. Because I think some of our audience might not know about the Feldenkrais method and Rolfing as well. I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about both modalities to give a little bit of context, and then also talk about how that's informed the way you look at movement and how that might be different from people who say have a personal training background or a gym background. They might look at movement in a slightly different way.
Yeah, so both Feldenkrais and Rolfing come out of kind of a somatic tradition, which is basically a tradition that involves kinds of mind body disciplines. Kind of, I'd say there's some similarity to martial arts, yoga, different kinds of body work, and the basic idea is that the way that you move has something to do with the way that you feel and the way that you think. So it's kind of like I don't really like the word holistic that much, but it's kind of like this holistic view of how things work together. At the time I got into these things, which is around 2000, I was really interested in moving better and feeling better because I was an attorney and I had a lot of chronic pain. And I was also competing in some racket sports and I wanted to move better. And at that time, there was, a lot of new information coming around from Gray Cook and Mike Boyle and functional trainers and PTs. The functional trainers were talking to the PTs and they were getting interested in this idea of kind of movement quality, not so much movement quantity in terms of how much can you bench or how much can you lift or how far can you run, but let's look at the quality of movement and try to assess that or measure that or improve that. And this is the time when people are getting into more kind of joint mobility drills and corrective exercise. And I just found that whole idea fascinating, that if you worked on your movement, that also might make you feel better and move better at the same time. That was always my interest. Feldenkrais and Rolfing were two ways to kind of go about that. Rolfing being kind of a deep tissue massage thing, Feldenkrais being a very mindful, slow, gentle set of movements, often on the ground, that are exploratory, curious, not prescriptive at all, often based on developmental movements like crawling and rolling and reaching. And I just got kind of curious in the whole field, not limited to these ideas at all either. Interested in things like CrossFit or powerlifting or functional training or aerobic training, anything that has to do with general health, chronic pain, stuff like that.
That's cool. Do you find that Feldenkrais as a modality is something that is a pretty big umbrella? Like, would you say that you would still consider yourself a Feldenkrais practitioner, or would you say that what you do now is sort of a combination of Rolfing, Feldenkrais, other things, and also a synthesis of what you've sort of discovered over the last few years?
Yeah, so Feldenkrais exercises are limited to kind of a small domain. They're always operating in the domain of being very slow movements, very gentle movements, very mindful movements. So they don't build strength, they don't build endurance. They're focused on improving your proprioception, your perception, your kind of self-image, changing the mind about the body. That's kind of a small domain of exercise. So I definitely am interested in other kinds of exercise because we need to do aerobic exercise. We need to become strong, stuff like that. But there are some general principles and ideas in Feldenkrais that I think are generally transferable to those other areas. And the Feldenkrais way of thinking affects my thinking in those other areas. And that's in the sense that in Feldenkrais, what it's a very student led playful approach to getting better at movement. It's not this top down prescriptive thing where the coach is telling you exactly what to do. It's more like asking a series of questions for the student. They go through these exploratory moves, they figure it out themselves. I think that's an idea that is applicable in many other domains.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just actually had an interview today with Matthew Remski, who's a sort of a yoga historian amongst other things. And one of the things we were discussing is how over and over and over again we see these social dynamics in physical culture and physical movement where it assumes this sort of top down teacher student relationship, but even more that, like almost in that looks like military drill, where you have people moving in unison, following the cues of the uh, the leader. And I guess with Feldenkrais, it sort of makes sense that it evolved differently as well because Feldenkrais was a judoka, wasn't he? He was a
Yeah, he was a judo guy. His
yeah.
he was a judo guy before he developed his own method. So he was influenced by martial arts. He was an interesting guy because he was a scientist. He was a trained scientist, so he had that kind of like scientific way of thinking. It was way back in the 30s and the 40s. But he also was interested in martial arts, yoga, self improvement. Around this time, that the whole world was just kind of like starting to discover the ideas of Freud, the idea that there's something going on under the surface that we can't access directly, and it has to be kind of accessed indirectly. And there was a lot of uh, not that sophisticated of understanding of that at the time, but he was one of many people that was kind of like trying to explore this kind of mysterious unconscious realm.
Um, yeah, it's interesting because yeah, you think of this area. There's so many interesting thinkers who are kind of coming out at that time. Obviously, like Freud being the underpinning for a lot of ideas, and I guess in some ways, I guess he would have crossed over with Bernstein. Some of the early motor learning stuff, and that's one of the things I want to talk to you about. Like, I know that you let me rephrase that. I think that one of the things you're really good at is synthesizing ideas from different practices and different modalities and making them relevant and easy to understand. So, a lot of ways I would say that you were one of the earliest popular communicators talking about things like ecological dynamics and Gibson's ideas of affordances and things like that. And I know they're not theories that perhaps are specifically associated with you, but I think that you were one of the people to kind of popularize them to different audiences. So I was wondering if you could talk about, from your work in Feldenkrais, how you kind of came upon ecological dynamic ideas, how you kind of came upon like ideas of affordances and, ecological psychology, Gibsonian psychology, things like that.
Yeah, so well, Feldenkrais himself was interested in Bernstein. Bernstein being this Russian physiologist that kind of changed the way people thought about motor control. In my mind, the big insight is that this is far more complex and difficult to control a body than we ever imagined before. And the control mechanisms that get it done are these kind of bottom up emergent mechanisms that we can't really control, as we've been saying with these kind of top down methods. And so this kind of like starts to help you understand why these kind of common sense ideas about learning make sense, like you have to learn things on your own or you learn from your mistakes. It kind of like promotes this idea of motor learning, which is much more like growing a garden and watering the garden than it is programming a computer or building a rocket ship like that. Another analogy I like is that learning how to move is more like trying to parent a toddler than to fix an electronic device. We see these incredible successes of in engineering, in mechanics, and with machines, and we want to apply that type of thinking to people, but it doesn't always work because people are too complex. There's too many variables. You can't measure them all. They interact in dynamic ways, and so you need kind of a different way of thinking. You need to respect the fact that the order in people is like something that comes from them. They self-organize. That's kind of a Bernstein idea, and you can't tell them how to organize. You can just put them in the right environment and hope that they kind of move in the right direction, like a toddler. You try to incentivize them to do this, you try to incentivize them to do that. It's mostly common sense. Most of what happens is going to happen from them. You could be a world class expert in child development and not significantly outperform someone who's just had experience doing this and is using their common sense. You might do a better job. It's a very different situation than like a car mechanic where you absolutely have to be an expert to do that. And you have to use the right tools and you have to measure everything carefully. With self organizing adaptive systems, it's a different situation.
Yeah, exactly. It's that contrast between complicated problems and complex problems, and that's it's usually the definition is, if it's a complicated problem, there's probably a manual that will tell you how to fix this part in the airplane. If it's a complex problem, then it's going to be multifaceted and dynamic, and everything is going to relate to everything else. Yeah, I really like the gardening versus maybe like an architect sort of analogy. And it's interesting because I think so much of the assumed logic in strength and conditioning and in gyms is that we're dealing with sort of complicated problems of input and output. And if you increase this volume by 2%, you can expect an output of this. And to a large part, it often ends up not being true. And I think sometimes people get frustrated with that because they like to imagine that we can control these variables. And I think that's probably a big part of gym and fitness and perhaps bodybuilding culture is that people would like to exert this kind of control over their lives, whether or not that's possible. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the people who that the one of the variables that tends to get left out of that equation is just the variable of motivation to show up every day. And the people that are really attracted to these programs that are highly prescriptive and say, now we increase this by 2% and now we increase it by 3%, they're highly organized people who have this incredible discipline. They can actually control themselves to do that in a top down way. Most people are not going to show up to exercise in the gym every day unless they're intrinsically motivated to do it, unless they really want to do it. They don't want to follow these blueprints that much. I mean, some people do, but you can't leave out that element of motivation, and that is exactly what tends to be destroyed by these methods that treat you like a machine.
yeah, it's interesting because I think a lot of, especially nowadays, and eh, I guess I don't know. Have you do you ever talk to Katie Bowman?
I actually haven't talked to her, but she doesn't
Okay.
live that far from me, and I'm
Oh,
familiar with her work.
yeah. I mean, you guys should have a chat. We had her on a few weeks ago. I'm sure she'd love to be on your podcast. But I think perhaps maybe the both of you have sort of stumbled or kind of come to the same conclusions because I think a lot of times you use the same languages of like of nutrition and movement, and both being so much more complex than just exercise. I think I've heard both of you talk about this idea that we try to reduce movement down to these finite variables, where in real life obviously it's gonna be much messier. Yeah, and it's one of the things I think of, that we've kind of assumed that there's like there's virtue in going to the gym. Like, if you want to be healthy, you have to move. If you move, it's going to be exercise. If it's going to be exercise, it's going to be in the gym, which means you're going to go and do these movements. And people feel bad if they don't go to the gym. And I don't think there's ever been any discussion that maybe going to the gym is a little bit weird. Like, I like going to the gym, but like,
Uh-huh.
I'm weird in a very specific way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. For me, a gym is kind of like a playground. When I go to a gym, I see a bunch of machines, and I'm like, that looks like a playground to me." But not
Yeah,
everyone's like that.
yeah. And yeah, it's interesting because Jill, she wrote a blog post the other day. She went to the gym a few months ago, and she got in trouble because she was trying to do like get ups in the gym, and was doing loaded carries and moving around. And the manager very politely said, sorry, we don't do that here, and you're taking up space." And it was a good point, because like, they have a finite amount of space, they need to fit X amount of people in. But it's interesting because I always think about how much of the gym is actually not about giving people movement choices. It's sort of funneling them to very specific, discrete movement choices. This is a machine where you do this. This is a machine where you do that. Which, in a way, can be empowering if you feel like you don't know how to use your body and what it's capable of. It's very nice to say, "This is the bicep flexion machine."
Yeah, yeah. No, that can be good. It's very it points to the fact that it's a very individual thing. I mean, you can't leave out people's individual psychology, the social element. There's all sorts of social things that happen when people go to the gym. They don't want to look weird. They want to play by the rules. All of those things matter.
Yeah. I guess sort of connected to that, and I guess I should talk to the audience for a second. One of the things I really want to do is I kind of want to ask some questions, based around some of the blog posts that you've done in the past that I've really enjoyed. So if the next few questions feel scattershot, it's because they're just ideas that I think you've communicated really well, and I'd really like for other people to hear. So one of the things, going from the gym and sort of the play, gyms and movement and things like that, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the concept of affordances and also negative affordances, and how that's been useful for you, the way when you think about movement and movement opportunities.
Yeah, so affordance, I think of affordance as just being like an invitation to move in a particular way. And if you start thinking that way, you become more aware of how the environment is affecting the way you move. We tend to be very kind of individualistic and think that everything that's organizing us is coming from inside our own head. There's this cool phrase from Gibsonian psychology, which emphasizes the role of the environment. Don't ask what's inside your head, ask what your head is inside of. And it just points to the fact that the environment's always organizing your movement. So when you go up the stairs and you see a railing there, you unconsciously get an invitation to use the railing to provide you with a little bit more stability. When you're in a house and there's no couches at all, the only way to sit is the floor. You see the floor as a place to sit, but when there's couches, the couches invite you to sit, and you're going to sit in the couch. So imagine the huge difference in your life between having couches versus not having couches. That's going to control the way you sit just by these subtle unconscious invitations that your environment is always sending you. The walkability of a neighborhood, the availability of green spaces. My kids' movement behaviors as they grew up were hugely affected by the presence of screens or iPads or other kids to play with in the neighborhood or places to play in the neighborhood. Huge effect on their behavior. One of my daughters, I tried to get her to ride a bike. She never wanted to ride a bike. She says, "I hate riding a bike. I'm just not the kind of person that likes to ride a bike." And then we went on this camping trip and got into a different environment. We brought the bikes. There was other kids there. They were all biking around. It was a very safe area to bike. No cars, nothing to worry about. She spent about like 7 hours a day biking. And I said, "Did you just suddenly become the kind of person that likes biking?" No, I just took her from one environment to another, and it radically transformed her movement behavior, what she thought was her own internal
Yes.
preferences, they weren't.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
was just the way she was being invited to do things in different environments.
I think that's such an important thing just to reemphasize because whenever you work with clients or individuals, it's always interesting. People will come in with these stories about what kind of person they are, what kind of person they're not, and it's exactly right. So much of it is based on the opportunities and the environment and how perhaps how they felt like they could interact with it. I've got a very similar story in that we organized a bike free day in our village about a year ago where we closed off various streets and things like that. We live in rural Scotland, so it was pretty easy. And it was amazing how many kids suddenly learned how to ride bikes on that day just because they had the space and the environment. And some of it was social, some of it was encouragement, but some of it was just being able to like ride and play around, not have to worry about a car, not constantly have to turn around. And it's incredible to think about what could be possible, if the environment was a little bit different. And later in the conversation, I would like to talk more about built environment.
Yeah, I mean,
What
just imagine like approaching the problem of kids not riding a bike in a different way, giving them information that says biking is fun, giving them information that says biking is healthy, telling them they should do it, handing them the bike. None of that stuff works as well as just creating a space for biking to happen, and you don't even have to tell them to do it. They'll start doing it on their own.
one of the things that's really interesting is because we do our adult classes outside and we have boxes and logs and we've got like sort of homemade vault boxes and things like that and rings and stuff like that. And sometimes we sort of do like these light sort of obstacle courses and we work on basic vaulting and things like that. But we try to make sure that because we're outside and we're in a nice space, we always tell people they can bring their kids if they want to, but we're not gonna watch the kids. So what's been interesting is there's been this parallel culture at one of our local groups of where the parents bring the kids and the kids kind of go play in the woods or hit each other with sticks or climb trees or whatever, but they're always kind of watching the parents. And so many of those kids who at the beginning would say that they're not, oh, I don't like this, I'm not a sporty kid or whatever, you see them when they have time off in the corner of the eye, they'll be practicing vaulting over the boxes or they'll be practicing climbing the trees in this way that if they were in a PE class and they said, now you have to get over that box, now you have to climb this rope, they would be absolutely horrified to have to do that. But if you just give them that space, all of a sudden, because they have that opportunity to explore in an informal environment, it's amazing. Yeah, what an effect it has. And I think it's a shame that so many of our opportunities to move are sort of mediated by large institutions, whether it's school or gyms or whatever.
Yeah,
Um,
and just by the social pressure and the social norms, something really, really subtle. Same obstacle, same movement, slightly different social environment is the difference between, "Hey, let's do this. This looks fun," and, "No, I'm embarrassed. I don't wanna do that."
yeah, exactly. And I guess something connected to that, thinking about affordances and how we use the environment. One of the things that you talked about one of your older blogs that I thought was really interesting um, is also how, as our capabilities change, our perception changes in the world around us. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, you just kind of, like, mentioned it, like, if you teach someone how to vault over to something, how to jump off of something, how to climb onto something, they didn't previously know how to do that. Now they perceive the environment differently. They perceive the environment as being something that affords a certain type of a skill. So, like when I remember when I grew up on the East Coast, not that outdoorsy. Moved out here to Seattle. Everyone was outdoorsy. All my friends were climbing. I was in my 20s, and they started climbing around the house. They would like get on the moldings and like do these traverses of like from the couch to the molding or something like that, and I would try it. And suddenly I had this skill set of being able to do that a little bit. And then as soon as I had done that once and seen it was fun and saw that I can do it, I started constantly seeing my environment differently. Instead of seeing a house, I saw a bunch of stuff to climb on. And I was constantly like being invited to climb on it all the time. I was doing
Yeah,
it all the time.
yeah, it's funny. Me too. I didn't grow up very sporty or moving or whatever, but yeah, I guess in parkour they talk about the idea of parkour vision, but it is a great example of affordances. How all of a sudden it's like, oh man, I could climb on that tree and I could do this and that, and a lot of it is also like we were saying about that narrative of just kind of getting over yourself or being in a culture or environment where you wouldn't be embarrassed to do that. One of the other series of articles you've written about in the past is you've talked a lot about pain and perception of pain. And I guess it makes sense because you have that history of chronic pain, which, or pain, when you're working as an attorney, which I think probably drove some of your exploration here. But I do want to talk about various aspects of pain, and also it'd be interesting to know if any of your thoughts have changed because some of the blogs I was looking at are 10 years old. Um, but let's just start. What is pain? What does it mean?
Well, the function of pain, the way it's supposed to function, is a signal that there's damage to your body and to motivate you to take protective action. So there's sensors all over your body. They're looking for tissue damage, chemicals that indicate the presence of tissue damage and inflammation and changes in heat. And they send a signal to the spinal cord up to the brain. The brain interprets the meaning of it and decides whether you need to be protected. And if there's pain, usually there's some sort of a tissue damage. But the interesting thing is that it's the system is it can really change its sensitivity level a lot. So we know this from inflammation. We know that when an area is inflamed, stuff that doesn't normally hurt can now hurt like hell. It's also the case, surprisingly, that you can have a lot of damage in an area and not have that much pain. The system can kind of desensitize. We know that people can have herniated discs and bulging discs and arthritis and bone on bone and not have pain. So the system's able to change its sensitivity level a lot. That can really confuse people about what does this pain mean. So sometimes people can start to really worry too much about a pain and become overprotective and not move enough. You need to keep moving. You need to exercise. You need to recover from an injury. But other people make the opposite problem and continue to move into pain and kind of ignore pain. This is kind of the more CrossFit type of a person that's kind of like, I can do it, or run marathons or keep running on things that hurt. You have the oversensitive people that don't move enough when they hurt, and that's a problem. And most people are pretty well calibrated. But when I had people come in with pain, I kind of try to help them make sense of it, make meaning of it, and make good choices on the basis of it. And different people make different uh, mistakes in interpreting the meaning of their pain.
Yeah, yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the discussion that we have about pain in culture. Again, I mean, you said it earlier, but it's one of those complex problems. Again, it's a complex, almost a gardening problem or a dynamic conversation with your body, rather than an input in, input out thing. And I'm someone who I had a really well, to me, it felt like a really bad back injury about a year ago, and I know exactly what you mean when your body is hypersensitized to things. And I was like, I couldn't walk for 5 days, and I mean, as someone who's experienced pain, you know what that can be like, and it's not even about having pain tolerance or anything like that. It's just about your whole body shutting down and the process of sort of coaxing movement back in, having that conversation, regaining that movement. And I definitely learned a lot in that process. And I went back and read some of your blog posts from the past, and I found them very helpful. Um, I guess the next thing I want to talk about is this idea of a nocebo effect. What is the nocebo effect?
Well, nocebo is the opposite of placebo. Placebo is basically the effect of the positive effect of good expectations on your pain. So if you expect that a pill is going to help with your pain, it might help just a little bit, and that's just because pain is complex. Pain is affected by your emotions. It's affected by your thoughts. It's affected by your expectancies. It's not just about the tissue damage. It's about inflammation, many things. So if you change your thoughts, you can change your pain a little bit. I don't want to, suggest that it's mind over matter or that this is a big factor, but it is a factor that can affect how you feel. Um, and a nocebo is just the opposite. If you have bad expectations, if you're catastrophizing, which means expecting worst case outcomes, if you're getting very afraid of movement, if you're constantly imagining worst case scenarios, if you're thinking that I'm broken, that I need to be fixed, those predict worse outcomes when you get injured. When you get injured and you start thinking, this is going to last forever, I shouldn't move anymore, I need someone to fix me, it's less helpful attitude than this is temporary. I can get over it. There's things I can do to control my pain. This too shall pass. That's a good thing to know, especially if it's true. Like the kind of many people get these back injuries. Their back is fine, and then their back goes out. They can't believe how much pain they have. It's like extraordinary. They didn't even think that this was possible. It's going on for 5 days. They can't walk. Luckily, I know that it's actually pretty common for people to have that and then get a whole lot better in 2 weeks, and then like the pain is gone. It may come back. I don't, but it's kind of it's surprising and it's helpful for people to know that it's a true thing that when they know it, they do better than if they don't know it and they start thinking this will last forever, which is a
I think
reasonable fear.
Yeah, yeah, no, but I think that's really important. I mean, that was a mantra I had in my head is this too shall pass, and you're right. Just having that knowledge that I just need to work through it and take my time in a way was really empowering. And also something that I think various practitioners do not always do a good job of communicating, depending on what modalities and what practices we're talking about. I definitely had an interaction with a few practitioners that I found really disempowering. And I think that had I not had the background knowledge on this, I think that I probably would have felt much more distraught over that situation.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Pain. There are good reasons to fear chronic pain because sometimes chronic pain happens, but in general, a more optimistic approach. I mean, we don't want to lie to anyone or anything like that. But you do want people to be aware of the possibility for improvement, and also it's healthy to keep moving. You need to keep moving, to go about your life. You need to keep moving for other aspects of your health, and many people will get very protective about their movement when something hurts. One of the things they might do is not they'll stop moving even though moving doesn't make it worse. I've had a lot of runners that are like, well, this I've got this knee pain, and so I stopped running. Well, have you tried returning to running? Well, it still hurts. Will it hurt even worse the next day? They haven't kind of noticed that maybe I could keep running and the pain wouldn't get worse.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
like you tried to stop. It's reasonable to stop running, see if it goes away. If it doesn't go away, try to start running again, see if it doesn't get worse. Sometimes that happens. So maybe your pain's not going away, but at least you can start running again.
Yeah, it's the fear avoidance patterns that you see in everything: fear of falling, fear of pain. Up to a certain point, I suppose, fear of socialization, but it's they can get away from you. They can create these feedback loops where your options for moving and engaging in the world become smaller and smaller and smaller. And anything you can do to give people that opportunity to kind of reverse it and try to grow out those concentric circles again, I think is going to be really beneficial. I guess my last question with chronic pain, maybe my last question, is I remember you wrote an article about mind body maps a few years ago, and I thought it was really interesting, and it's something I hadn't really heard articulated anywhere else. And I found it a very useful model to think about these things sometimes. So can you talk about these mind body maps and also how they might relate to chronic pain?
Yeah, so there's this. It's a metaphor, really. There's parts of your brain that are always tracking sensory information from the body, and they are trying to figure out where everything is, um, uh, what movements are happening, whether the body is safe, and these maps are used to coordinate your movement. They're used to regulate your movement. They're also used to figure out whether there should be pain. So there's a part of my brain that's always tracking information from the foot, what's touching it, how long this muscle is, what things are moving. That's used to organize my movement as I walk. This helps me know whether the foot just touched the ground or what muscles need to be organized. And there's also sensors in the foot that are figuring out whether you just stepped on a something dangerous and what that means. And if there's a lot of nociception coming from the foot, the part of the brain is going to figure out whether this is from running or something else. So what these maps are basically doing is kind of like helping you make adaptive perceptions about whether the body is safe and what it's doing, and then make take actions like protecting the body or organizing the body and stuff like that. And these maps kind of like have a lot of discretion, and they can be improved. We can become more skillful at perceiving the body. They can get overly protective. I lost my train of thought a little bit on this, but I'm just kind of rambling.
No, that's good. Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing I was thinking about is that I think in one of your articles you were kind of saying that maybe it was through fMRI research, because I think, and maybe I'm conflating this with something else, but I seem to remember reading something about, like, for example, like a pianist, if you were going to hook them up to an fMRI and you're going to ask them to imagine moving their fingers, that they would tap into a much richer and varied part of their brain than someone who hadn't developed that same level of, I guess, dexterity. And I think that the reason I was asking is because I think I remember you saying, and this has nothing to do with what you're saying about discretion and perception, is that often when people have, I guess, less detailed maps, acknowledging that this is perhaps, a metaphor, sometimes the chronic pain perception is higher. And then as people sort of use their bodies more, that sometimes the quality of the chronic pain changes, or perhaps it becomes less of a chronic issue. Does that still ring true
Yeah,
to
yeah.
you?
The story that I've told on that is over the years, I think the research has changed a little bit, but as a general matter, we can say that the parts of the brain that are perceiving the body, they adapt over time. And you're right that musicians like have observably larger finger maps in their brain. The parts of the brain that control the fingers are actually larger in musicians, so they adapt over time. And one of the things that happens with chronic pain is that the brain is always paying attention to the nociceptive signals, the danger signals from, let's say, the back. And it's forming this image of the back that is just, this is damaged, this is hurt, this needs protection. It's not paying as much attention to the proprioceptive signals that are coming from the back. As a result, people start to lose the clarity of their ability to imagine what's going on in the back. They lose differentiated movement there, and they lose a little bit of control over what's going on there. So part of what you do in Feldenkrais is you try to produce this rich sensory information from the injured area, the back, without creating all of the nociceptive signals. So you can kind of like clarify the map of that area. It's kind of, you can kind of like get a better feel for what's going on in that area. All you've been feeling in that area is pain for a while, and so you're kind of forming this image of that area that is just this big block that can't move without hurting. You want to kind of introduce the ability to perceive the area in a different way.
Yeah, I find that. Yeah, I found that really interesting. And again, it's one of those ideas that I think sort of was helpful for me when I was experiencing back pain, just about really sort of interrogating the pain. Neil Teasner, who I quite like, he uses the term flirting with pain sometimes, where in the process of kind of figuring out these windows that you have that are pain free, and kind of getting that stuck hinge, and then just trying to work a little bit more movement into it. And for me, that idea of kind of exploring and differentiating different movements and pain, I found that very helpful for me as
Yeah,
I
I,
kind of.
I like this. You mentioned the word exploring. I think a metaphor that I think is a little bit easy to understand about recovering is like exploring a territory. So there's, imagine there's like this movement map, and there's this territory. There's all these places you can go with your back. You can go here, you can go there with your back, and then you get injured, and now you're kind of living in this really small area. As the tissues heal, you need to go outside again and start exploring. Can I go into this area? I feel a little danger. I'm not going to quite go. But if you just stay home, you won't recover this lost territory. To recover the lost territory, you've got to take these small risks. You don't want a big flare up, but you got to go out there and see what you can do. You might be surprised that, oh, I can actually lift weights. And you kind of see, does it hurt while I'm doing it? Does it hurt later in the day? Does it hurt tomorrow? If it's okay, then you retake that territory and you kind of establish a base there, and you try to keep retaking the territory that you've lost to age or disuse.
I really like that metaphor. I'm definitely going to steal that from you.
I think it's better than the maps one.
I wanted to ask one more question before I talk about the book, because I've been really enjoying your new book, and you've kind of answered this one already, but I kind of wanted to kind of delve into it a little bit deeper, which is we are kind of already talking about affordances and opportunities to move, invitations to move, and things like that, and then also the gym and movement, and one of the things that I'm always mindful of is that when we often talk about movement, it's often couched in the context of a personal practice, which I think is good. I think it's important to have a personal practice, whether it's meditation or yoga or qigong or really any way that you sort of think about your body, its relationship to the world. But then sometimes it feels very small, it feels very small scale. And one of the things that we really try to think about at Wildstrung is how can we create these opportunities to move on a larger scale, because I think right now the way we talk about movement, especially within the fitness industry, which I guess you're kind of on the periphery of, is that it always seems like it's something individualized, maybe something that is sort of turned into a product. So the question is like, imagine that all of a sudden you started working for like a public health authority or local government, and they said, hey, look, we want to get more people moving. We know moving is good. What do we do? How do we kind of scale up accessibility to movement and getting people, spending more time sort of in this embodied existence?
That's a really good question. It's a very tough one to answer. I think that our culture is definitely keeps heading in the direction of individuality, 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 and the internet, and even what I'm doing is kind of points in that direction. You're reaching one person at a time, and I'm kind of thinking on that individual level. On the more social level, maybe one thing that you can do is base your movements on things that don't require quite as much prescription and coaching. That if you have people do the kinds of movements that are very natural human movements that really do just emerge, if you just put people in the right environment, I think those should be the movements that you base your social practices around. There's some types of movements that really need to be taught. I mean, if you can't, I don't think it would be that good of an idea to just have a bunch of heavy barbells and say, hey, everyone, go nuts on those deadlifts and see how they go. You kind of need to coach people through that, or like doing a backflip or learning to play the piano. But things like running, things like crawling, rolling, climbing, those are just kind of human movements. They don't require as much coaching. People do them naturally. There's a natural instinct there, a natural ability to learn them. So if that's the basis for your collective movement practices, that's one thing. But getting the culture right is, I think, a real trick. I think that people are becoming much less groupish. They're more and more and more aware of the potentially oppressive or limiting aspects of being involved in a group, and we're getting better and better and better at saying this limited my personal expression and my personal identity, and this was kind of risky for me, or there was some oppressive element to this. And those are really, really good points, because so many of the group structures in our society over the years have been racist or sexist or oppressive or limiting personal creativity. But being involved in a group is like the soil in which humans grow, and so when you get just try to do it all on your own, you're missing out there. So creating a culture where people don't feel limited at all, but could still be part of a group is not easy. I mean, I know when I went to these CrossFit gyms, I really enjoyed the group energy, and they're playing Rage Against the Machine, and everyone's doing the same thing and moving at the same time, and it's great. It gives me a ton of energy. However, for me personally, it encouraged me to do something stupid, which is to work way too hard.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so because of that, I work better on my own, but I'm missing out on that group energy. And I would love to go for runs with people and get their energy instead of running on my own. But however, what happens when they start running a little bit faster than me? I want to keep up. I'm going to hurt myself. I won't do the right dosage. So it's a real trick.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, and as a former CrossFit coach, same thing. Like, I love the good aspects, like the community, the getting people together, but it's always two sides of the same coin. It's those same things that can sometimes lead to I don't know, high demand social dynamics, or all or just pushing yourself too hard. Yeah, what you said is interesting because I remember when we first started working with older populations, I kind of thought it's like, well, I know the movements people are supposed to do, and what I mean is like, okay, well, I know that you're supposed deadlifts are good for people and squats are good for people and all these things. And within 5 minutes, I realized that there's absolutely no way that you can expect a group of people who are in their 70s to solve movement problems in the same way. And it's almost like if you come into that group with a top down, fitness sort of prescriptive way of thinking rather than inviting them to solve different movement problems, there's just no way you can do it because then you end up in this decision tree of like, okay, this person has a sore knee, so I'll give them that scale. And for this person here, I'll substitute this for that. And for this person here, and before you know it, no one's really having a good time and everyone sort of feels like they're not doing what they're supposed to do, as opposed to, as you alluded to, which is just giving people an opportunity to interact with the environment, whether through rolling or crawling, whatever that looks like for them. It just ends up working much better.
Yeah, well, kids in a playground, they decide what game to play, right? You just
Yep.
provide the space.
Yep.
They're the ones that decide which game to play, the rules of the game. That's kind of like integral to what's going on.
I think so. And it all goes back to kind of what you were saying about, just giving toddlers that right environment, not trying to calculate every single variable and just, give them the opportunity to pick things up and walk around and, just explore and then, see what comes out of it. I wanted to shift gears and talk about your book. So, as listeners might have figured out already, you're publishing the chapters of your book. Instead of doing it all at once, you're sort of releasing them on Substack, which I've really enjoyed because it's great to see where your thinking is on this. But I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your new book, why you decided to publish in this format, and what that experience has been like for you so far.
Yeah, so the book's called Healthy Movement for Human Animals. It's like this evolutionary perspective on exercise. I'm going to look at about 10 or 11 different kind of natural primal human movements like rolling, crawling, walking, jumping, climbing, stuff that are just very natural for humans to do. Look at them from an evolutionary perspective, like how our ability to do these movements evolved over time. Like humans are really good at climbing because we're primates and our ancestors lived in the trees for 40 million years. I'm going to look at the development of movement in infants, like, first infants roll and then they crawl before they walk as a way to kind of get an idea of, getting a little bit of an idea of how to progress and regress different movement capacities. I think it's informative that the order on the evolutionary time scale in which we gain the ability to do things. Our ancestors were quadrupeds before they were bipeds. Kids crawl before they walk. That's kind of interesting. Um, so I'm going to look at each movement and talk about development, talk about evolution, compare, um, look at how these movements are used in sport and rehab, and just kind of like see what we can learn about exercise from these lenses. And it's not intended to replace more conventional ways of looking at exercise that we get from, the tradition and experiences of coaches coaching people, and from epidemiology, or from random controlled trials. It's supposed to just provide kind of a big lens to organize that material and complement it, partly based on the idea that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution.
Yeah. No, I think you did a really good job of communicating that, both sort of providing this lens and a little bit of context. And, one of the things I think you said in your introduction is getting away from this idea of you must or must not do certain movements, as this message often gets reduced down to in social media. And you kind of talked about using this lens of evolution as a reference point, just for sort of internal sense making. And I thought that was really useful. And I was happy to see you just sort of talk about, using this idea of an evolutionary perspective. And I guess it's because, and I was talking to Katie Bowman about this a few weeks ago as well. Like, you remember that period back in 2008, 2009, where like paleo was sort of becoming a thing and people were discovering Frank Forensich and, all these other really, I think, really interesting and influential thinkers. And there's sort of this high watermark, I think, of synthesizing these different ideas. And obviously with the internet, things got a little weird in one direction, or people, followed something perhaps a little bit too much. But I thought it was a really empowering way of looking at the world and making sense of things like nutrition and Well, even the way we socialize and play, a lot of the more modern thoughts on play and play as sort of this really beneficial part of being a human. And then I felt like you don't really hear much about it anymore. I don't know if it's because sort of the internet and TikTok culture has kind of consumed a lot of these ideas and made them mainstream now. I don't think that's it. I think that for some reason, a lot of this evolutionary language kind of died out maybe, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago. What's your perception on that?
But yeah, I was definitely around for all of that. I was kind of into all the paleo nutrition stuff and some of the movement stuff in the 2000s. I had kind of friends in the community like Stefan Guillenet. And, it started out with just kind of a blogging situation. And there was this community of people that were all interested in this stuff. And it was a good lens to be looking at things. But people started thinking it was the answer to everything. There was a lot of paleo fantasy. There was a book called Paleo Fantasy. The professional critics started to come in and say, look, you guys are getting really carried away with some of this stuff. You're trying to replicate being a caveman. You're eating meat all the time. You don't really understand what this environment was actually like, and you're extrapolating way too far. And those were some very, very good criticisms, which kind of like woke me up and said, okay, got kind of carried away with some of this stuff. On the other hand, a lot of that this does remain a valid lens for looking at things, and there have been some people that have done a very rigorous job of like thinking about what can we learn from evolution as applied to exercise. Like Daniel Lieberman, the paleontologist from Harvard's got a really good book called "Story of the Human Body," and I think called "Exercised," which are good evolutionary perspectives on exercise that don't engage in kind of paleo fantasy kind of stuff or naturalistic fallacies. A lot of that stuff also got, I think, kind of monetized and turned into businesses, and kind of it lost its innocence a little bit. So yeah, things go in and out of fashion. It's a good lens for looking at things. It's not the only lens. My book, I'm going to try to give a balanced account of what we can learn from this and what we can't learn from this.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job in the introduction as well of letting people know that you're not going to do the caveman LARPing. Um, yeah, Lieberman's books are great. I think they just provide a lot of balance because you can tell that aspects of the lens of that evolutionary lens are really useful for him, but he's very good at not going too far down and saying, well, yeah, like whenever he does his sort of ethnographic work, he really lets you know it's like, well, realistically, it's not as though the Hadza are like running 20 kilometers a day barefoot, to gather honey. It's a much different, perhaps most romantic existence. How much time do you have left? It's about 40 past, and I want to be respectful of your time. Okay, cool. All right. Well, let's do that then. I kind of wanted to talk about your book, and you already talked about this, how it is sort of organized in these different worlds or these different realms that sort of parallel both human development and also, evolutionary phases. And I think it'd be just interesting for the listeners to kind of get a sense of each of these phases. So just going down and kind of talking about what you want to draw people's attention to with each one. So I guess the first one I think is ground world, if I've got it right, and sort of talking about ground flow and things like that. Could you just kind of explain
Sure.
what
Sure,
your
yeah,
ideas
so
behind
the
ground world?
idea is that if you look at if you really zoom out on human movement and you look at from the evolutionary perspective, you kind of see patterns that are harder to see up close. So, if you look at really the history of of human evolution, you go back to like the first animals come out of the sea, and the first thing they start doing is kind of crawling around on four legs. And our bodies evolved for a very long time. The first time that spines start to get upright is when our ancestors get into the trees and the spines become upright to allow you to grab things overhead. And then that upright, that familiarity with the upright spine is what allows us to start toddling along on two uh, legs for a while, and then getting better at being a biped. And it's not until the arms are free that we are ever picking stuff up. It's probably one of the reasons that we actually uh, did get become bipeds was because this is a huge advantage to be able to carry kids and to carry resources around. And if you look at the development of kids, they kind of go through this similar pattern where they're on their bellies, like the first amphibians, and they're kind of using these reptilian crawling movements. They start crawling around on all fours. Before they can stand up, they're using their arms to like pull themselves up on couches. And then they start running around on two legs. So I just kind of looked at this and I said, well, there's kind of this progression from the ground where you're really close to the ground, the belly's close to the ground, the spine is horizontal to the trees, where the spine becomes vertical and you're climbing, to being on 2 feet. And I said, I'm going to kind of organize all of my different movements into these different worlds. A ground world, which is the most primal, which is the one that's kind of like that babies are in. This climbing world where you're mastering your body weight with these pushing and pulling movements that looks a lot like kind of functional exercise, really. You're pulling yourself towards things, you're pushing yourself away from things, you're doing step ups and squat like movements to move up and down. And then the bipedal world is kind of like the world of field sports and agility and running and jumping and walking. And it's not until you get through all of those that you get into what I call the fourth world, which is the world of using your energy to manipulate objects by picking them up, throwing them, or using tools. When we get in the gym, we get right to that object world where everything's about manipulating other objects. We don't spend that much time on the ground. We don't spend that much time mastering body weight. That's just kind of a big pattern that I see from looking at this that I think is a little bit interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well because I think of sort of the emergence of physical culture. Wherever you want to draw the line. Obviously, you can talk about the Greeks, but I think we probably owe a lot more to like early 20th century, whatever muscular Christianity or all the various physical hygiene movements, everything like that. It kind of I kind of get the sense that that's where like a lot of our assumptions about physicality came from. But it's funny because like yeah, right away you go to the gym and all right, you got to get a barbell, you got to manipulate these objects and things like that. But yeah, you're exactly right. We don't really think about what are people's capabilities, before we get someone doing a barbell back squat, you know, what does their unweighted squat look like, or can they transition from the ground to like a kneeling position easily? And I think you were kind of talking about Mike Boyle and Gray Cook, and I think they did a really good job of talking about that even however many years ago. It's like, well, do you really want to build? And they might have said the word dysfunction back then. I don't know if I would use that word now, but do you really want to build, strength on top of dysfunction, or does it make sense just to kind of go back and play around? And as someone, when I first started getting into lifting, I started off with powerlifting because it made me feel good. I was a kid. I wasn't very athletic. I wasn't very fast. But I found that if I just showed up every day and put more weight on my back, then all of a sudden, I could end up with not an amazing, but a pretty respectable back squat. But even to this day, I still don't have a resting squat. I don't have a relaxed squat, and this is after years and years and years of trying different modalities and mobility and stretching and working on range of motion. And I'm still kind of stuck at that sort of like Mark Ripito back squat, hips just maybe at parallel or just above. Um, and it's I wasn't actually realizing I was going in this direction, but I think I will. Which is when we talk about ground world, I think there's been this real sort of tendency to put the resting squat on a pedestal. But one of the things that occurs to me, and Katie Bowman talks about this a lot, in terms of you have certain windows in your life and physical development where perhaps if you didn't grow up squatting, you might never have a resting squat available to you because maybe you didn't develop the squatting facets in your ankles, or maybe perhaps the morphology of your femur and your pelvis never really matched up. Um, and I guess what I'm asking is, do you think that we put too much emphasis on the squat as one position when there's so many other positions that are open to people in ground world, or do you think that is still something that's really worth focusing on?
Yeah, it's a good question. So by ground world, I just mean like, well, I guess to really give you a good idea of what I mean, I've got this video of the Hadza from Frank Fornkitch, and Frank Fornkitch shows kind of like what the lifestyle is for people living in natural environments without couches, without chairs, lots of time spent on the ground, deep squat positions, half kneeling positions. And it's not just hanging out, it's kind of moving around and transitioning from these different positions. This is kind of the lifestyle, natural lifestyle for humans. And it's the natural lifestyle for kids too. If you watch kids play, they're on the ground and they're constantly transitioning between these different positions. If you tried to do that as an adult that doesn't do that very often, it's tough. Um, so that in this video, these guys are sitting around by the fire. They're in deep squats. They're reaching for things. They're kind of like walking around in the squats. If you watch it, you're like, wow, that's impressive. I can't do that. And it just, and so, you know, to go to your question about whether we think this stuff is too important, if you've lost some movement in the hips and or some movement in the ankles by neglecting these movements for say 10 or 20 years, it is going to be hard to reclaim because a lot of that gets into the bones. It's an adaptation in the hard parts of your body that aren't going to adapt. It would be nice to reclaim those if you could, but it doesn't mean that you should never do anything else. That doesn't mean you now have a dysfunction. You can't do anything else. It might make it harder to do some of the things that you want to do. And I think it would be preferable if you had these kind of natural ranges of motion. It doesn't mean you just can't go out and do anything else. I mean, I've had, professional athletes come into me, professional football players who don't have that much dorsiflexion. They're still pretty athletic and capable of doing stuff. They might not be able to sit in a deep squat. So, humans are resilient. There's many ways to do things, but I do think that there's some logic to the fact that some capacities we have are more kind of uh, primal and fundamental and foundational, and they form the foundation for higher capacities. There's some logic to that, but it's not an absolute logic.
I think that's probably a pretty good place to wrap this up. And I'm wondering, is there anything else that you want to talk about, or anything else that you wish we brought up while we were talking about all this?
No, I don't think so. It's thanks for having me. Great questions, fun conversation.
Yeah, yeah, I had a lot of fun. Really, thanks for making time. I really appreciate it. I had a good time.
Day, night. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Oh, what a fantastic conversation. Another one of those ones that I feel like needing to go back and take notes. I really love some of Todd's metaphors, like movement learning as parenting a toddler, or recovering movement, like sort of retaking lost territory. These are ideas that we talk about at Wild Strong, but it's just always good to have Todd articulate them much more clearly than we ever can. As I mentioned at the beginning, you can subscribe to his Substack and be part of the chapters as they come out from the Healthy Movement for Human Animals. I would really recommend do that. It's really fascinating reading them as they come. Don't forget to subscribe to the Playful Nature podcast, please, please, please. It does make a big difference. And if you're feeling really kindly, you could leave us a review. Next week, we'll be back with a chat with Dr. William Bird, which I think will be really useful for a lot of you, particularly anyone working in public health. He is a GP, but also runs a company called Intelligent Health. He started out working with Dom Higgins, who is with us recently from the Wildlife Trust, on Green Gym, and now Intelligent Health fingers in lots of public health pies, particularly, or possibly most notably, Beat the Street, which is a really interesting multi-generational, I guess, public health intervention that encourages families through slight gamification to get to school by different means. So whether that's walking more, cycling more, wheeling, running, whatever it is, and exploring different routes in your neighbourhood through this big game that lasts, I think, 6 to 12 weeks. And the data that comes off that in terms of sustained long-term physical activity is really impressive. So I think you'll love the conversation with William Bird. It touches on a lot of what we've been talking about in the last few episodes, particularly on kind of embedding health within the community. So we'll be back then. Have a lovely couple of weeks.